Surprise, my camera's not working. So I'm doing all of my defensive rankings videos with just this whole disembodied voice. We're kind of going old school film room on you. We're starting off with inside linebacker. This is a really, really good linebacker class. One of the most complete and deep linebacker classes I've seen in a really long time. And it was tough to rank these guys as a result because they're all pretty close to each other in the grand scheme of things. Again, we have this laid out in a tier system, tiers 1 through 4. And I don't include every linebacker in this class because I didn't want this to go on forever, but we hit probably the top 20 or so. And then for the rest of the linebackers in this class that are going later in day 3, if you're curious on my thoughts on them, again, we're doing that live stream over on the Bootleg Football Podcast channel, every single pick, all 3 days, 22 hours. We're going to be talking about every single linebacker as they go off the board. So if you're interested in getting our thoughts on them live, head on over to that channel, subscribe, hang out with us throughout the draft, and yeah, it'll be a fun weekend. So with all that out of the way, I'm going to start off by getting to tier 1 of my linebacker rankings, which very similar to a couple other position groups in this draft class. I only have a one-man tier 1, and that's going to be Devin Lloyd from Utah. The reason why I have Devin Lloyd as my only tier 1 linebacker is not because his overall grade is astronomically higher than anybody else. It's because when you look at his strengths and weaknesses, he doesn't really have any weaknesses. Most of the guys that I have in tier 2 at least have something I can point to that is a problem or, maybe a concern or a scheme limitation, just some reason why some teams might not like them as much as others. But when it comes to Devin Lloyd, he kind of is scheme agnostic. You could probably put him in any defense, in any role that you want to, and he would fit. So when trying to project who the first linebacker off the board is going to be, I think the fact that he is at least of some use to every single team in the league, that counts for a lot in my opinion. If you want him to play a pass rushing Sam linebacker role, he can do that because he's really explosive and bendy off the edge. If you want him to play more of like a cleanup will linebacker role where it's just run and chase and hit, he can do that as well because he's really, really rangy. Or if you want him to play almost like a Darius Leonard type Mike linebacker role where, he's stacking on guards, working through traffic, doing all that kind of stuff, doing zone drops as like the hook to curl player, pretty much everything that Darius Leonard does, I think that Devin Lloyd can do, and maybe even a little bit more. And I know it's almost unfair to compare him to an all-pro, but athletically speaking and just from the tape, like watching everything he did at Utah, you do get kind of like a twitchier Darius Leonard kind of vibe. The one knock that people point to, if you can even call it that, is, sometimes he might have little issues tackling here and there, but I do think it's a little bit overblown. Like, I disagree entirely with the notion that he is a bad tackler. That to me is not true. His missed tackle rate last time I checked was hovering somewhere around 11.5%, which certainly isn't amazing. The Georgia guys, Tyndall and Walker, were somewhere between 4.5 to 7.5%, which is amazing. But 11.5% is pretty much dead on average. Like, there's a lot of linebackers in this class that are hovering, 13, 14, 15%. Some of them are, even close to 20%. So again, I don't necessarily think that he has tackling issues. He's just not as good of a tackler as the Georgia guys. But when it comes to literally everything else, I don't think he has any holes, which to me is why I have him ranked above that Georgia trio. I can't quite say for sure that he definitely will be drafted in the first round because it's tough to project any linebacker going in the first round in today's climate. It's kind of a position group, just like running back, that has seen its value depressed, I would say, over the last 5 years. So it's tough to really pull the trigger there. But I will say if there was any linebacker in this class that I think should go in the first round, it's going to be Devin Lloyd. But all of that being said, when looking at my relatively giant tier 2 of linebackers, I do think that all of them are fantastic players in their own right as well, and all of them, or at least the vast majority of them, will likely be immediate starters too. And this whole tier of linebackers includes names you're probably familiar with, like Leo Chenal from Wisconsin, Channing Tindall, Quay Walker, and Nakobe Dean from Georgia, Troy Anderson from Montana State, Chad Muma from Wyoming, and Christian Harris from Alabama. Remember, as always, this tier is in no particular order. You can order them however you want. I just see all of their grades as very comparable, and different teams are going to value them differently depending on how they run their defense. So don't take this as like a hard and fast ranking. It's more so just a cluster of guys that I see as very similar overall talents. So I'm going to kind of go one by one here and start with Leo Chenal. And the teams that I think are really going to value Chenal highly are the ones that are looking for a gigantic, physical, hulking middle linebacker, somebody who gives them a lot of pass rush versatility, somebody who I think can take on guards by themselves and stack and shed and do all of that dirty work as a really physical run stopper. The role that you see thrown out a lot for Chenal in terms of, comparing him to somebody who's already in the NFL is going to be Dante Hightower and everything he did with the Patriots. And I think that Chenal can do all of that stuff and maybe even a little bit more because he's a little bit more fluid than Hightower was in coverage. So if you want him to be a hook dropper and kind of, be able to use that drift technique and move side to side and close down passing windows as a zone dropper, he can do that as well. Maybe not man coverage. I don't necessarily know if I trust him in that role. So you're going to need a safety or a lighter linebacker if you want to prioritize that. But I think in terms of zone coverage ability, blitzing ability, run stopping ability, he can do everything that Dante Hightower does and maybe a little bit more. My dark horse destination for him on day 2, beyond obviously the New England pick that everybody's kind of expecting, I think he's kind of got an outside shot to go to Pittsburgh because I think that they're looking for another big, competent pass rushing inside linebacker, especially with Brian Flores on that staff now, and he knows how to use those type of guys. I really would not be surprised if he ends up as a Steeler on day 2. He kind of fits what I believe they're going to be looking for to augment their existing linebacking core. So just kind of keep an eye out for that. I just wouldn't be shocked by it. And that'll bring us to, I'm just going to talk about all the Georgia guys together as a trio, to be honest, because I think it's easier to do it that way. But Channing Tindall, Quay Walker, and Nakobe Dean all have different skill sets, but I think they all complemented each other really well in that Bulldog defense. If you watch my expanded scouting report on Nakobe Dean, I kind of made my thoughts on him known there. I think he's more of a sub-package player, to be honest. I think he can play linebacker for you full-time, but I would almost want to use him as like a hybrid linebacker, safety, you want to call it money backer, dime backer, whatever word you want to use. But that kind of, ancillary linebacker that you bring in on passing downs because he's a really good blitzer and he's really good in coverage. I think if you want to use him on early downs, it kind of depends on the fronts you want to use and the personnel you have up front because he will need to be protected. I don't necessarily think he takes on blocks super well just because of, how small he is, relatively speaking. So it kind of does depend on what you want to do with him. But there are teams that I think would love to have him as an immediate, I guess you could call it a third down starter, if that's even a term, just because of the versatility that he does bring in coverage and as a pass rusher. Meanwhile, you have Quay Walker, who I think is more of a traditional Mike linebacker. He does not have nearly the same speed of Nakobe Dean or Channing Tindall, but I do think that he has really good hips and really good feet for his size. I think he's a phenomenal tackler. Like, he pretty much never misses tackles, to be honest. I think he's really physical in the box. I think he takes on blocks well. I think he never misses coverage assignments, even though they don't ask him to do that much. It's pretty much, playing hook zones or, maybe he'll buzz out a little bit in certain looks to kind of do curl flat. They don't really ask him to do any of the man coverage stuff that Nakobe Dean does, so it's hard to project him a little bit more in coverage, but I never saw him make any mistakes. Like, he always did his job. He always picked up his guy running through his zone. He just didn't really do anything wrong ever. So I know he's not the same athlete of the other guys, but I think he's really, really solid. I think some team's going to fall in love with him as a traditional Mike linebacker on day 2, and I think he can fill that role really well. Now, if you're looking for way higher upside overall, and maybe even higher upside than Dean, then you're going to be more interested in Channing Tindall, who has crazy, and I mean crazy, closing speed. Like, his ability to run down plays in the open field is almost unmatched by anybody in this class. He doesn't quite have the same hip fluidity of Dean, but I still think overall it's not a problem for him, and I do think he makes up for a little bit of hip tightness just with raw explosiveness. Like, his first 2 steps out of his break are just insane. And when you package that together with the physicality that he brings inside the box, like, he doesn't take on blocks as well as Quay Walker, but I do think he blows them up, which is a slightly different skill set. Kind of using your body as a missile to gum things up at the point of attack versus stacking, shedding, getting off, making the tackle. it's kind of a different approach to it. He's more of a battering ram than like a true Mike linebacker, but hey, there's uses for that as well. I think if you put him as a will linebacker and just say go run and hunt, he can be phenomenal in that role. And I think that he's also underrated in coverage too. Again, they asked Dean to do more of the man coverage stuff than Tyndall or Walker, but when we saw him at the Senior Bowl, I mean, he was doing all the zone match stuff that you want a modern linebacker to be able to do in all your trips checks, being able to open the hips and, be the quote-unquote 3-up-is-3 player deep down the field. Like, he was doing that just fine in Mobile. So I think just kind of looking at Tyndall, they didn't have him cover because he couldn't cover. They just didn't have him cover because they had a guy that was better at it, which is a totally different problem. So overall, again, looking at Tyndall, phenomenal closing speed, really good tackler, super physical, maybe a lot less nuanced than Walker or Dean, but some linebacker coach is going to see his physical gifts and absolutely fall in love. And if he went somewhere in the second round, I really wouldn't begrudge that at all. I think he's very talented and well worth that kind of pick. And I could say the same thing for Troy Anderson from Montana State as well. And he has a lot of fans in the league. I think he could be one of the first 3 or 4 linebackers taken overall, if I'm being completely honest. Because even though he is relatively new to the linebacker position and to playing defense in general, you wouldn't really know it just from watching him on tape. Like, he does have really good instincts. He's a sure tackler. He's a crazy athlete, like one of the most athletic linebacker prospects ever. And I do think it's interesting that, looking at how he was used at Montana State earlier in his career as like a Taysom Hill type player, like you can even see his athleticism show up when he has the ball in his hands. So if you want him to be a two-way player for you, both as a starting linebacker and as a package player on offense, if you want to run some of the quote-unquote Taysom Hill stuff in your offense, maybe if you don't have a quarterback who's mobile enough to do it, or if you want to take the hits off their body and just have Troy Anderson do it, like he is really, really fast, really elusive, a physical runner. He can do all that stuff for you as well. So I think kind of what puts his value a little bit higher than a lot of other guys is that two-way potential, not to mention the fact that even though he is basically brand new as a linebacker, he's kind of further ahead than a lot of other linebackers in this class too. Looking at overall upside for him as a football player on offense and defense and on special teams, he's kind of unique. He's a little bit of a unicorn here. So I think somebody's going to fall in love with him. He's going to go in the second round, almost guaranteed in my book. And I'm not entirely sure where he's going to go because it kind of depends on, how much you want to use him on offense, how much you want to use him on special teams, or if you want to make him just a star linebacker for you. He's just fascinating. I'm really, really excited to see where he goes because the possibilities here are pretty much limitless. And then rounding out tier 2 here, we have Chad Muma from Wyoming and Christian Harris from Alabama, who are basically opposite ends of the spectrum here. Muma is a solid, reliable middle linebacker who has phenomenal instincts against the run, gets off blocks super well, always in the right spot at the right time, extremely sure tackler, like maybe the best pure tackler in this class. He almost never misses. And just like Chanel, I do think that he is functional in zone coverage. Maybe not, crazy rangy or super fluid or anything like that, but at least he's functional in that role. If you just want him to be a hook dropper all day, he can do that for you. Don't ask him to do anything else, but again, in that role, he'll be fine. But I think what he brings as a run defender and as a blitzer is really, really special. He's one of the best in this class at that role. So if your run defense sucks, draft Chad Muma. He's going to fix it really, really quick. And then again, to finish off this tier, on the entire other end of the spectrum, we have Christian Harris from Alabama. And the thing with Harris is he is smaller, faster, lighter, way more fluid. You can tell that he used to play DB in high school because he moves like a DB. Like, I honestly believe that if he dropped weight, you could probably put him at safety and he'd be fine. He's a very explosive mover in space. But man, he misses a lot of tackles. Like, the problem that people think Devin Lloyd has with tackling, Christian Harris actually has. He is very inconsistent in that area. I think it's the one thing that drives me nuts about him is that he misses a lot of tackles, even though he gets in position for them. And I do think that he does take on blocks better than Nakobe Dean, even though he's, similar size, similar role. I think he's a little bit more physical at the point of attack than Nakobe is. It's just that he can't finish the play. He misses tackles a nauseating amount of the time, and it's just so frustrating. So I think that, again, limited role player here, but he's very good in that role. And he has the upside to become a more complete player. That's why I have him in this tier and not the tier below, because I don't think it's a physicality issue. I don't think it's an effort issue. I don't think it's an intelligence issue. Like, he's always in the right spot. He's reading really well. And again, he's flowing to the ball. He's hitting his gaps. He's doing what he's supposed to do. He's just not finishing the play. So if his next NFL staff, whoever drafts him, can teach him to tackle and just, get from like a 15% missed tackle rate or whatever it is, it's something crazy high, get it down to, Channing Tindall range of 7.5%. Just cut the missed tackles in half, and he's going to be one of the best linebackers in this class. But for now, God, it is frustrating because he is so talented and so explosive and so good in coverage. It's just, the end part of the job, the most important part of the job, actually getting dudes on the ground. That's the problem here. So once again, kind of bird's eye view of this tier. A lot of talented players in it. I think all of them are going to go somewhere on day 2. It's tough to project exact destinations, but they're all extremely talented in their own way. They all play different roles and they all have different skill sets, but what they do well, they do really well. And if they go to the right destination for each one of them that, knows how to use them, knows how to nurture them and kind of round out their games over time, I think all of them will be really good starters, probably from day 1. And that will bring us to tier 3 of these linebacker rankings, which I am dubbing high upside role players. Some of these you could even argue as being tier 2 type talents, but for whatever reason, I just kind of had to move down a little bit lower than all the tier 2 guys. All of them do, in my opinion, have a really good chance to be good players in the league if they go to the right spot and if medicals check out, of course. So kind of looking at this group from top to bottom, we have Damone Clark from LSU, Brandon Smith from Penn State, Jesse Luketa, also from Penn State, Malcolm Rodriguez from Oklahoma State, and Jack Sanborn from Wisconsin. I'll start with Damone Clark at LSU, who is extremely talented. He's got range, he's got physicality. I think he's really, really underrated in coverage, and I think he has good enough hips and explosive ability where I think he can actually handle running backs one-on-one in space or even tight ends because he's got some size to him as well. And when you look at him off the field, again, he wore that hallowed number 18 at LSU, which you don't get to wear that number unless you are truly an exceptional leader, arguably the leader of the program. So the fact that he got to wear 18 and he's as good of a physical talent as he is makes him a highly attractive linebacker prospect to me. And I would argue that if we're just grading film and football character and all that kind of stuff, he's probably a better linebacker prospect than several of the guys in the tier above him. But the problem, and there always seems to be a problem with somebody who's this talented but I have ranked this low, is medical concerns. He actually showed up to the combine and they found a herniated disc and they said that he's going to need spinal cord fusion surgery. He's going to miss the entire 2022 season. And I am not a neurosurgeon. I am not an orthopedic surgeon. I'm not anything medical of any kind. So I have no idea what his prognosis is in order to come back from that and potentially be able to play football again in 2023 or hopefully soon after that. I have no context for how bad this is going to be for his future or his present. All I know is he needs spinal cord fusion surgery, which is a pretty big deal, and it's going to be up to individual team doctors to decide if that is a big enough deal that they have to pass on him or not. It is very possible that he goes undrafted because of this, because people don't really like messing around with spinal injuries. That is a very serious thing, and this is a very serious surgery. I do think that he is one of the better linebacker prospects in this class. As I mentioned, he has all the physical tools. He has all the football character. He comes from a grade A program playing against top competition. He is legitimately awesome as a player, but the medical red flags honestly scare the shit out of me. I don't really know what to do with it. So when you look at his profile, he could still go day 2 if the doctors are confident that he'll recover, and he might go undrafted. We'll just have to find out. But either way, at least on film, he's really, really good. And then I also want to talk about the 2 Penn State kids kind of together as a duo. That's going to be Brandon Smith and Jesse Luketa. Luketa is a hybrid defensive end / off-ball linebacker, which I know sounds like a weird combination, but he does have experience at both spots. Personally, for me, I kind of want him in a defense in the NFL where he can shift down and be an edge rusher on third downs, because I think he's a much better pass rusher than he is in coverage. In fact, I think he's a little bit of a liability in coverage unless he's just kind of doing like spot dropping or something like that. But when you line him up just as an edge rusher, I think he's really, really fun. He was killing people all week at Senior Bowl week. I mean, he was beating all of these really good tackles that are probably going to get drafted on day 2 or maybe even day 1. And so I do think he brings a lot of value to the table from that standpoint. And I also think he's a pretty physical run defender as well. So I think he brings some value there. I think if you put him in a system where he's kind of an off-ball linebacker on early downs, where you can use that size and physicality to stop the run, and then on third downs, you kind of protect him from coverage by just moving him down to rush off the edge, almost kind of similar to how Von Miller was used in his rookie year in Denver, where he was an off-ball linebacker and then he became an edge rusher on third downs. If you use him that way, I think that's probably his ideal role. Now, I also think that there might not be that many defenses in the NFL these days that are going to be willing to do that, but I think if other defensive coordinators around the league kind of looked at how Dallas used Micah Parsons, who ironically also went to Penn State, and kind of how he was used as an inside linebacker and then as a pass rusher on third downs, if you're willing to kind of create that role within your own system, Jesu Luketa, I think, can be pretty valuable in that type of scheme. And then Brandon Smith, the other Penn State linebacker in this conversation, he is arguably the most athletic linebacker to ever come out of Penn State, and that's saying a lot because they have had some freaks. In fact, if you just look at relative athletic score, or RAS, which measures all of the different components of athletic testing, the 40, the jumps, size, 10-yard splits, 3-cone times, all that kind of stuff. If you just look at Brandon Smith's athletic profile, because he's really big, he's really fast, he's really explosive, he's really, really agile. If you look at his whole athletic profile, he's actually the most athletic linebacker to come out of college in the last 25 years. That means more athletic than Micah Parsons, more athletic than Patrick Willis, Tremaine Edmonds, Luke Kuechly, like all of these great linebacker prospects that were fantastic athletes in their own right. Brandon Smith is more athletic than literally all of them. And that athleticism, at least in my opinion, shows up on tape. Like, he is capable of doing things at his size that I did not even know were possible. And I guess it does kind of make sense because he was a consensus 5-star and he was recruited everywhere. Like, he could have gone to Bama, he could have gone to Georgia. He was the Gatorade Player of the Year in Virginia. Like, he's always been a freak. But just kind of seeing these numbers put on paper and just seeing how he moved on tape, we're talking a different level of physical ability here. And I know you might be wondering, okay, Brett, if he is such a crazy athlete, why is he not ranked way higher up in your tier system? And it's because he still doesn't really know what he's doing yet. I kind of get a lot of Tremaine Edmonds vibes from his tape where it's like, man, he is so physically gifted, but he is still so young and so inexperienced, and he's still struggling to read blocks, and he's still struggling to get off blocks. Like, his technique is raw. Everything's raw. And he only started for 2 years, keep in mind. So he hasn't played that many games. And one of the years that he was starting in, was heavily impacted by the pandemic. So, I mean, he is as raw as it gets. But in terms of the ball of clay that coaches have to work with, Brandon Smith is a 1 of 1. I would bet that he goes on day 2 just because of that physical potential. And if he does go to a linebacker coach that knows how to get the most out of him and just kind of look at this former 5-star nationally recruited, unbelievable athlete and get him to play to the ceiling that he is capable of, we're talking about an all-pro linebacker here, almost guaranteed. Like, that is the ceiling we're talking about here. I'm not guaranteeing it's going to happen, but man, it's possible. So I think he is worth a pick somewhere on day 2 because of that. And then rounding out tier 3 here, we have Malcolm Rodriguez and Jack Sanborn, who are both also really, really fun to watch, but for entirely different reasons. Malcolm Rodriguez is kind of the next best thing that you're going to get to Nakobe Dean, I would say, in terms of build and skill set and everything like that. Like, he's built pretty similar to Nakobe Dean, around 5'11", 230, really, really thick, kind of like a sawed-off shotgun type build. But he's also extremely explosive and arguably even faster than Nakobe Dean is. I think that 40-inch vert really shows up on tape. I think the low 4.5 speed really shows up on tape. Unfortunately, we don't have a full testing profile for Nakobe Dean. Apparently, he had a pec strain that kind of kept him from doing a lot of different testing. So I'm not entirely sure how to compare it fully, but I do think that at least on tape, I think Malcolm Rodriguez might actually be faster than Nakobe Dean. Like, he is really, really quick. The one thing that Dean has over him is I think that Dean has better feet and better hips in coverage, and I also think that his instincts are probably a little bit better. But man, Malcolm Rodriguez is not that far off. If you don't get Nakobe Dean, and if you don't want to deal with the tackling issues from Christian Harris, but you still want that undersized and really fast sub-package linebacker, I think Malcolm Rodriguez is perfect. He'll probably go somewhere early day 3, I would say, but I also think that he's going to vastly outperform that draft status just looking at his explosiveness, his instincts, his special teams versatility. Like, I think he's going to be a special teams demon. Man, I love Malcolm Rodriguez. I know he's going to go lower than what I even probably have him ranked as, but man, he's a really, really fun player to watch. And then closing off this tier, we have Jack Sanborn from Wisconsin, who is not even close to as physically gifted as Rodriguez or even as Brandon Smith or Damone Clark. He's probably the least athletic linebacker in this entire tier. But when you look at the instincts, the physicality, the technique, he is, in my opinion, one of the most refined linebackers in this class, and he was the cleanup crew for that entire Wisconsin defense. I can't tell you how many times, when I was watching Leo Chenal, and Chenal does get a little bit over-aggressive at times. That is one of the knocks that I forgot to mention, where, he might kind of get out of position a little bit or overrun something, or, he might get caught up in traffic because he takes a false step, and the run fit would get completely fucked up. Like, they were going to have a giant crease, and then Jack Sanborn would come out of nowhere and he would clean up the play, and it was only going to be a 3-yard gain and nobody would be the wiser. But if you're familiar with run fits and just kind of how a run defense is structured and how these linebackers are coached to play, if you're really familiar with that kind of technical nuance, you would know, like, hey, Chenal fucked up there and Sanborn saved his ass. And he would do that every single game. Like, he was the cleanup crew. He would make everybody else correct, even when they weren't correct. And I think that there's value to having that kind of linebacker where everybody else can kind of freelance a little bit or, be aggressive and make mistakes, because there's always going to be that guy on the back end to make the tackle and just kind of save everybody when stuff goes wrong. I get a lot of Matt Milano vibes from Sanborn, which is a huge compliment because I think that Milano's one of the most underrated linebackers in the entire NFL. And Milano does a lot of that same stuff in Buffalo too. Like, Tremaine Edmonds will step in the bucket and just kind of run himself out of position sometimes. And Milano, will completely leave his gap and somehow make the play anyway and make everybody else right around him. I think Sanborn is that same type of player. He's not super flashy, he's not crazy athletic, but he's really smart, he's really physical, he gets off blocks, and most importantly, he's just really good at making the defense correct, which in the end, coaches love that kind of player. So tier 3, again, high level look here. You have a lot of high upside role players that in their own ways are really, really athletic. And then you also have Jack Sanborn, who's not the same level of athlete, but is maybe just a better football player. And then finally, kind of ending things here on tier 4, and I'm going to go through these guys pretty quickly just because a lot of them have very similar notes about them for one reason or another. I label this group as limited role players or special teams demons. I think that Balin Spector from Clemson, DeMarco Jackson from Appalachian State, Mike Rose from Iowa State, and Darian Beavers from Cincinnati, they're not all exactly one-to-one comparisons in terms of their role as Mike linebackers, but I do think that they're all going to be drafted roughly in the same general vicinity as Mike linebackers. They all have different qualities that I think kind of make them stand out from one another. Like Darian Beavers, I think, if you miss out on, say, Leo Chenal, and you still want that big, hulking middle linebacker that can offer some pass rush versatility in that type of system, Beavers is going to be a guy you look at for that. Mike Rose and DeMarco Jackson, I think, are sort of in between, where like they're more traditional Mike linebackers, maybe not as much pass rush to them, but a little bit more coverage ability than Darian Beavers. But what they both bring to the table, I think, is also being better and more physical against the run than a lot of the undersized linebackers that we talked about previously. So they're just kind of typical solid Mike linebackers, the tree stumps you put in the middle that I think can rack up a lot of tackles. And then Baylon Spector, at least when you look at his listed weight, he is smaller than all those other guys, but I think he plays bigger than his frame. He's really thick, really strong, and also really smart. Like, I interviewed him down at Shrine Bowl, and he was a great conversation. Got to talk a little ball with him, and he's just really, really whip smart. I think coaches are going to love him in the room. And I also think that he's a little bit better in coverage than those other guys too. You know, a little bit more fluid in the hips, a little bit more explosive in short areas. I think if you run a predominantly zone system where he can be a hook dropper and just kind of, you know, read quarterbacks' eyes and make plays on the ball, I think he can do that pretty well. When I was at Shrine Bowl, actually, he had a crazy interception over the middle while wearing a club, which is really hard to do. So again, I think he's one of these guys where in the right system, where it's more zone coverage than man coverage, and you're looking for, you know, kind of a do-it-all linebacker that maybe isn't super flashy, but is really smart and is just going to come in and do his job every day, that's going to be Baylon Spector. And then after all those, you know, kind of typical Mike linebackers, we have a trio of smaller, lighter role players. And that's going to be Brian Asamoah from Oklahoma, Nephi Sewell from Utah, and JoJo Domann from Nebraska. Domann specifically, he kind of played more of an overhang role in that Nebraska defense where he wasn't really in the box that much. It's kind of like a hybrid nickel linebacker role where he's playing out in space. You know, he's covering guys in the flat, he's blowing up screens, he's handling wheel routes, he's blitzing off the edge. Again, it's not a typical linebacker role that you see in the NFL, but just from a movement skills perspective, I think he's really, really fun to watch. And I think that if you trust your linebackers coach to kind of teach him how to read and play within the box, you know, maybe you can look at him as like a sub-package player where if you do not go linebacker early at all, you know, you don't take Christian Harris, you don't take Nakobe Dean, you don't take Malcolm Rodriguez, you want somebody on day 3 that still has athletic ability that you can develop. I would say that JoJo Domann is probably that guy you target. And then I also think that Brian Asamoah and Nephi Sewell could fill that role as well, though I think that Asamoah is more on the inside linebacker spectrum, where Nephi Sewell is more on the safety spectrum. Like, I truly think that if Nephi drops some weight, you could probably play him at safety and be okay. He is the most DB-ish linebacker out of all of these linebackers in this tier because he does one thing and one thing only, and that is cover people in space, but he is really, really fucking good at it. Like, that is the one thing that I would want him on my roster for is, hey, you are our matchup weapon in dime, handling Austin Eckler or Christian McCaffrey or Alvin Kamara. Like, you are the guy that takes away that receiving threat, and then we can handle all the other receivers with all the DBs. But if he is just playing that one role in third downs, it is worth the roster spot because he does that so exceptionally well. So just kind of keep an eye out for wherever he goes on day 3 because that is basically going to be his role from day 1. And then Brian Asamoah, man, I wanted to like him a lot more than I did because I heard all this hype. He tested really well. I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. He's going to be, like a Kirkland brand Nakobe Dean. And he's just not. The instincts and the physicality are not the same. I do think that kind of similar to Nephi, honestly, if he drops some weight and plays safety, maybe that would make a little bit more sense for him. He's in this really weird size spot, like as a tweener, where it's tough to kind of project position for him. So he would probably also play the same type of sub-package role that Domann and Nephi do, where you bring him in on third down and he just covers running backs or covers tight ends, and that's what he does. I don't trust him on early downs at all right now, to be honest. I'm not saying he can't get there eventually, but yeah, I think the third down tape versus the first and second down tape were two entirely different stories. So, man, I wanted to like Brian Asamoah a lot more than I did. I think he's a really good athlete, but he just is not there yet as a complete linebacker, to put it diplomatically. So that's kind of how I'm looking at Tier 4 as a whole. We have Baylon Spector, DeMarco Jackson, Mike Rose, and Darren Beavers as your Day 3 Mike linebacker depth pieces. We have Brian Asamoah, JoJo Domann, and Nephi Sewell as kind of your money backers, your dime linebackers, your coverage specialists on Day 3. And then we have Aaron Hansford and Zakoby McClain, who, again, are more kind of developmental depth, but likely special teamers in terms of how they're going to get on the field. So that'll wrap it up in total for today. Hope you guys enjoyed kind of an old school disembodied voice episode. And then remember, we have the mock draft special coming up very soon this coming week, right ahead of the draft. I hope you guys also come along for the draft live streams over on the Bootleg Football Podcast channel. And yeah, I'll see you then. Later.